back to the next lecture in NO 105. This time, we're exploring questions related to citizenship, borders, and security in North America. We've already seen in this course how there can be powerful forces leading to continental integration. At times, these forces are led by governments. At other times, we might think of them as more organic. Economic, social, and political relations just seem to take hold between the peoples of North America in a much less directed way, from the bottom up, so to speak, rather than from the top down. This can seem especially true in the borderlands of North America, those parts of the continent where national boundaries between the three nations become the sites where commerce and people directly interact more intensely. These borderland areas really raise our awareness of the tension between nations and sovereignty on the one hand and continental integration on the other. But let's begin, as we always do, with the story of a North American who symbolizes or best represents the topic we're addressing. This time, that person is Maher Arar. His unfortunate and really horrible story of being caught up in the fortress North America security establishment serves as a sad and concerning but perfect example of how the ideas of borders and citizenship are so closely related to the notions of continental and national security. Arar was an immigrant to Canada. In 1987, he arrived here with his family from Syria at the age of 17. Within 4 years, he had become a Canadian citizen. Like so many teenagers, he headed off to university, in his case McGill, where he took courses in computer engineering. And it was while he was at McGill that he met his future wife, Monia Mazig. By 1997, Arar, Mazig, and their 2 children had settled in Ottawa. For a time, Arar also lived and worked in the U.S., but he had, by 2001, returned to Ottawa, where he was living a busy life as a telecommunications engineer and an entrepreneur. In 2002, Arar and his family had gone on vacation to Tunisia. On the 26th of September, he flew home to Canada earlier than the rest of his family so that he could return to work. As it turned out, his flight to Montreal had a fateful stopover in New York at JFK Airport. As soon as Arar landed in the United States, he was detained by the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service, the INS. Immediately after his name had been entered into a computer at the immigration counter, he was pulled aside, fingerprinted, and photographed. His belongings were searched, and the New York police and FBI were summoned. Arar asked for a lawyer, but was told he had no right to a lawyer because he was not an American citizen. For almost 2 weeks, Arar was detained in the U.S. and questioned about alleged affiliations with Al-Qaeda, the terrorist organization led by Osama bin Laden at the time, that had been behind the infamous attacks on September the 11th, the previous year. The American authorities were especially interested in Arar's connection to another Canadian, Abdullah al-Maliki. The Americans suspected al-Maliki was involved in some way with Al-Qaeda, a suspicion that later proved entirely unfounded. Still, U.S. officials had a copy of Arar's lease agreement with his landlord, and al-Maliki's name appeared there, either as an emergency contact or as a co-signer. Arar protested that al-Maliki was just a casual acquaintance. Yes, they had met from time to time, and Arar had worked with al-Maliki's brother, but that was it. As his detention continued in the U.S., he was finally allowed to briefly see a lawyer, though his later requests to see her again were denied. He was also visited by a Canadian consular official. Finally, it seemed as though his ordeal in New York was about to come to an end when American officials told him he would be deported. Arar was given the choice of going to Canada or Syria. Technically, he was seen as a citizen of both countries. Though he had definitely become a Canadian citizen, Syria doesn't recognize any renunciation of that citizenship. In any event, Arar chose to be deported to Canada in a written declaration. Then, on October the 8th, Arar was awoken at 3 a.m. and told that the INS director had decided to deport him to Syria. When Syria refused to take him directly, the decision was made to fly him to Jordan first. He was placed on a private jet and flown to Amman, Jordan via Rome. On arrival in Jordan, he was blindfolded, shackled, and repeatedly beaten by Jordanian officials until he was taken to the Syrian border and given to Syrian officials. While both Canadian and American governments maintained this was a deportation, in reality it was an extraordinary rendition. This term is used typically to describe a circumstance when one government transfers a person from its country to another without following proper legal requirements and protocols for doing so. The Syrian government was known to use torture to get information from those detained in its prisons. By sending Arar to that country rather than Canada, his questioning would be continued by Syrian authorities under very difficult conditions. In fact, Arar would later confirm that many of the questions he was asked by the Syrians were identical to those posed to him by American authorities during his detention in New York. Once he arrived in Syria, he was placed in a basement cell about 3 feet wide, 6 feet deep, and 7 feet high. There was no light. As expected, he was regularly tortured, often being beaten on his palms, his wrists, his lower back, and hips with a shredded black electrical cable. He was threatened with electric shock and a tire into which prisoners were stuffed or immobilized so that they could be beaten even more easily. Even when he wasn't being tortured, from his cell, he could often hear the screams of other prisoners as they were. Back in Canada, his wife Monia had started and sustained an enormous public appeal to have Arar return. She became the public face of the movement to bring Arar back and was an outspoken critic of Canada's treatment of her husband. At an incredibly difficult time in her life, she courageously and repeatedly told her story so that other Canadians could understand and appreciate the implications of what was being done to Arar. Finally, in October 2003, Arar was released from Syrian prison. His detention had lasted almost a year, and in that time, Canadian officials visited him no less than 7 times before he was finally repatriated to Canada. At the time of his release, Syrian authorities confirmed that though they had tried to find information linking Arar to terrorism, they couldn't. They also denied using torture in the process. In a statement he delivered soon after his arrival back in Ottawa, he said, quote, "What is at stake here is the future of our country, the interests of Canadian citizens, and most importantly, Canada's international reputation for being a leader in human rights, where citizens from different ethnic groups are treated no different than other Canadians." After his return to Canada, Arar Amazik fought tirelessly to clear his name and to expose the complicity of both the Canadian and American governments in his dispatch to Syria. An early victory in this effort came in September 2004, when an internal RCMP investigation acknowledged that the police force had acted improperly in Arar's case. The RCMP had given American authorities sensitive information about Arar without attaching any provisos about how the information might be used. Remember that Canadian rental agreement that Arar was confronted with by American authorities. And there was a clear suggestion that at least one RCMP officer was aware that the Americans were planning to send Arar to Syria, and he did nothing about it. In addition to the internal RCMP investigation, the Canadian government established a full commission of inquiry to investigate and report on the actions of Canadian officials in the Arar case. The highly respected Associate Chief Justice of Ontario, Dennis O'Connor, was appointed to lead the inquiry. The commission heard from nearly 100 witnesses, but the United States refused to share any evidence it may have had, and the American ambassador to Canada at the time of the incident, Paul Cellucci, refused to testify. The commission released its report in September 2006, some 4 years after Arar had first been detained in New York. Justice O'Connor categorically cleared Arar. There had been absolutely no evidence that he had committed any offense or had ever been a threat to Canada's security. O'Connor also concluded that the RCMP had given misleading or inaccurate information to the American authorities, had deliberately smeared Arar's name in the media, and had done this knowing that by facilitating Arar's removal to Syria, the Canadian citizen would be tortured there. Within months, Prime Minister Stephen Harper issued a formal apology to Arar on behalf of all Canadians, and the government announced Arar would receive $10.5 million in compensation for his ordeal and additional funds to cover his legal costs. Canada is meant to have core values of justice and equality, and yet Arar's story suggests these are not equally applied to all Canadians. And Arar's story is also very compelling, partly because it seems to completely fly in the face of Canadians' views of themselves and their positive role in the world. Especially in the period after 9/11, much has changed in the way both security within North America and terrorism abroad are approached. Harar's case, happening as it did so soon after 9/11, is very symbolic of these changes in domestic security and foreign policies. That's it for this part of our lecture. We'll see you in the next part. Bye for now.
And the way I was jumping on the bed as well, or the couch.